Hey guys, tonight we're going to peel back the layers of history and step into a Viking longhouse, where the flicker of tallow lamps casts warm shadows across timber walls, and the scent of wood smoke clings to your clothes. You settle down on a carved bench, careful not to knock over a clay pot of ale, and you can almost hear the crackle of gossip from voices that lived 1,000 years ago. These are the hidden worlds of Viking women, and believe me, you probably won't survive this if you think it's just men in horned helmets swinging axes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, pop your location and local time down below so I know where you're watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the packed earth floor of a longhouse, past hanging fish and drying herbs, and you realize women were at the very core of all this. Hidden behind the legends of raiders and berserkers, they managed everything from the butter churn to the farm fields. It's easy to imagine these women hunched over a loom, weaving wool dyed in earthy madder reds and woad blues, but don't think they were chained to the spinning wheel. Viking women held the keys to the family storeroom, and those keys were more than hardware. They were symbols of authority. You, standing here in the doorway, can sense that even in a world built on swords, the daily bread depended on these women's power. One mainstream fact historians agree on is that Viking women could inherit and own property. Unlike their medieval sisters in most of Europe, they could even run the household alone if their husbands were off pillaging or dead on a distant battlefield. Some women, left behind while their men went raiding, had to command workers, collect rents, and oversee harvests. It was basically a small business empire disguised as a thatched farm. A quirky tidbit: some women buried their good luck charms or even half-finished weaving inside the house walls to keep spirits happy, a bit like tucking a lucky rabbit's foot behind a modern fridge. Of course, historians still argue whether these women truly controlled their wealth outright, or whether male relatives ultimately called the shots when push came to shove. You see, the sagas leave gaps and contradictions, as if even the storytellers couldn't quite decide how far a woman's freedom should really go. That ambiguity is baked right into the sagas you hear drifting across the hall tonight, as the wind rattles the wooden shingles and a dog barks somewhere outside. Your footsteps echo as you explore the darker corners of the longhouse, where barley is stored in great wooden bins and cheese dries on shelves. The smoky air clings to your hair. One woman you might have met here would know precisely how much grain was left, how to stretch it through a lean winter, and which neighbor was behind on the rent. She might even trade a measure of mead to smooth over an insult or patch a frayed alliance. It's business and politics wrapped into one warm kitchen, and it's easy to forget that a single burnt loaf or a spoiled barrel could ripple out like a stone in a pond, affecting the entire community. Let yourself picture the daily rhythm: up before dawn to stoke the embers, milk goats, maybe scold a servant who broke a clay cup, then out to the field to supervise planting or bring in hay. And if you think that sounds cozy, remember they still risked infections, childbirth fevers, and injuries that could kill them faster than any axe. It was a hard world, and a woman's power was always balanced against that constant sense of danger. Even their clothes carried hidden signals. Brooches, for example, didn't just hold cloaks closed. Their style and materials announced the woman's status to every guest crossing the threshold. The rich might flaunt imported silver brooches with elaborate animal designs, while poorer women settled for plain bronze. When you see the glint of metal on a woman's shoulder, it's not just jewelry. It's practically a neon sign saying, "Respect me, I am the mistress of this house." Listen carefully as you pass the hearth, where bread is baking on a flat stone. A young girl hums an old song while minding a pot of porridge, maybe dreaming of the day she'll have her own keys hanging from her belt. That small ring of keys, clinking with every step, was her badge of adulthood, proof she'd earned the right to command a household. That sound would echo across the years, long after the warriors left for distant shores. And don't forget, the longhouse wasn't just four walls. It was a hub, a place of gossip, of alliances made and broken, of children learning how to handle the world. While the men were gone, these women became the calm eye of the storm, maintaining farms, livestock, and family ties, so there would even be a home for the warriors to come back to. If the women had failed, the entire Viking Age might have fallen apart like a rotted shield. Sometimes late at night, you'd hear a woman whisper to the gods over a carved wooden idol, praying for a good harvest or safe childbirth. That's a private side you don't see in saga heroes, but it was no less heroic. So remember, as you settle deeper by this warm hearth, Viking power was built on far more than iron swords. It was also built on the shoulders of women who held homes together, quietly fierce, their stories mostly lost to history but still echoing through these smoky rafters. You shift a little on that rough-hewn bench, feeling the air thicken around you with the stories that these walls have absorbed. And the next thread in this tapestry of Viking women's lives is marriage. Forget the fairy tales. Marriage was a contract, a negotiation, a chess move in a larger game of family alliances. Viking women, though, had more agency in this arrangement than many medieval women elsewhere. Picture a young bride, her hair carefully braided, wearing a necklace of amber beads to signal her family's wealth. She could bring a dowry, yes, but she was no helpless pawn. The dowry was legally hers, even after marriage. If her husband dared to mistreat her or break the marriage contract, she had the right to leave him and take her dowry back. Try doing that in medieval France, where women were basically property. You watch a woman stand tall at a wedding feast, holding up a drinking horn with steady confidence. This is no fragile princess. Her new husband might think he holds the power, but she has something he needs: a strong household, social ties, and sometimes land to build his name upon. Even the sagas whisper of wives who use their position to tilt a family's fortunes or protect their children's inheritance. Historians still argue whether these women could truly steer the ship of marriage on their own, or whether their fathers and brothers always had a hand on the tiller. But you can feel the sharpness in these women's glances, the quiet way they weigh every word spoken at the wedding table, suggesting they were far from passive. A fringe tidbit: some Viking brides were married with a ceremonial sword placed in their lap, symbolizing not just fertility, but also the expectation they could defend their home. Think of it as a prenup with a blade attached, and if a husband failed in his duties, a wife could return to her family, no shame attached, and even remarry without being labeled spoiled goods. That was practically revolutionary in a medieval world obsessed with female chastity and obedience. Later, you slip out of the hall into the twilight, breathing in the scent of damp grass and wood smoke. Behind you, the feasting still roars on, but out here the voice is quiet. A newly married woman might look up at the stars, wondering whether her match will be gentle or cruel, supportive or harsh. She might say a silent prayer to Frigg, the goddess who guarded marriage and the hearth, to watch over her. And if you listen close, you can almost hear the ancient verses praising a wife who managed the household with wisdom, balancing generosity and frugality so the family name stayed strong. Dowries were more than money. They could include livestock, carved furniture, or even imported silk if a family was truly wealthy. These items were a lifeline, especially if the marriage went sour. Imagine a woman in the far north, snow pounding the roof, deciding she'd had enough of her husband's violence. She could pack up her children, gather her dowry, and leave. The law would be on her side. In Viking eyes, a bad husband broke the contract, and contracts mattered more than any illusions about romance. If a woman did divorce, she could expect to keep the dowry and often the children too. Yes, children. Viking law tilted surprisingly in favor of mothers, at least compared to other medieval cultures, where children usually defaulted to the father's control. And because these children were a family's future workforce and legacy, that was no small matter. The woman's ability to protect her offspring was a testament to her power, an unbroken line from the moment she first held those household keys. Walking back through the doorway, you catch sight of a wife gently scolding a small child near the hearth. That child might one day inherit the farm, or sail to trade silver in Constantinople, but right now they are learning what loyalty means from the woman who keeps the family together. The power of a Viking woman was rarely in open battle, though some did take up arms, but rather in this unbroken chain of teaching, protecting, and negotiating. Even something as ordinary as a wedding feast was thick with power plays. Brothers sized up allies, fathers weighed dowries against blood feuds, and women had to read the room with razor-sharp awareness. Who looked away when she entered? Who tried to corner her with sweet words? One misstep could cost her future security, so a Viking woman learned from girlhood to measure every smile and every gift. It sounds exhausting, right? But you have to admire their resilience. And there's your second gentle joke for the night. At least you never have to negotiate your entire future over salted herring and sour ale. These women did. And they usually came out the other side still holding those keys, their dowries intact, their children safe. Maybe later, when the wedding songs fade and only embers glow, a woman would slip away to whisper her private hopes, that her marriage would be more than just another barter of cattle and linen, that perhaps it might even have room for kindness. Historians still debate whether true affection ever fit into the harsh contracts of Viking marriage. Some sagas suggest it did, hidden like a glowing coal under all those cold calculations. Either way, you sense how powerful these women truly were, standing between two families, forging alliances as strong as any sword, and ready to break free if they had to. Remember that image, the clink of keys, the ring of silver, and the quiet certainty that no matter what happened next, she had the law and her own fierce courage to back her up. The glow of that hearth seems to follow you into the next story, and you realize that Viking women's power extended far beyond marriage. It lived in the daily management of the farm. You can practically smell the fresh milk, the dried fish, the earthen floors brushed clean by hands that had never once been idle. If you thought farm work was all grunting men swinging axes, guess again. Viking women ran the show on the homestead, especially when the men sailed off to raid or trade. They weren't just feeding goats or mending tunics, they were controlling the entire economic engine of their world. Picture a woman calculating how much barley to grind, which sheep to cull, how many slaves to loan out for haying. Historians still argue whether these women got enough credit for keeping the Viking world functioning, but you can feel it in your bones. If she fumbled the accounts, the family starved. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some sagas say women could even trade precious items on their husband's behalf while he was gone. That means she might negotiate with merchants from faraway Russia, weighing silver coins in a hand roughened by years of wool spinning. In one sense, she was the CFO of the family. Imagine having to handle your husband's loot money while also making sure nobody burnt down the grain shed. At sunrise, you see a woman throwing feed to chickens while a child trails behind her, wide-eyed. She checks the fences, counts the lambs, and in the same moment scolds a neighbor who tries to shortchange her on a sack of grain. A Viking woman could be gentle, yes, but mess with her assets, and you'd meet a temper sharper than any sword. And let's be honest, there's something powerful about a person who can negotiate for wool weights 1 minute and chase off wolves the next. You duck inside the longhouse again, where the woven wall hangings show a pattern of distant lands, a subtle flex, a signal that this family had trade connections. And who kept that web of trade intact? The woman with the keys jingling from her belt. Those keys were literal and symbolic, opening chests of coin or locking away the family's most important documents. The key holder was queen of the home, no matter how far her husband roamed. Jokes aside, though, you can feel how heavy that responsibility was. If a ship went missing, if a trading partner defaulted on a deal, it fell on her to smooth things over. And because Viking society relied so much on honor, a woman's ability to manage the household preserved her entire clan's reputation. If she let that slip, the shame would ripple through the whole village like a sour note in a bard's song. Some scholars debate whether these women truly had free reign or were micromanaged by male relatives. But the surviving law codes, runestones, and sagas leave tantalizing clues that they could make decisions with real autonomy, especially in their husband's absence. You picture a woman standing in the smoky doorway, arms crossed, staring down a neighbor who had borrowed one too many oxen without paying them back. There's something beautiful in the ordinariness of it. She didn't need a sword or shield to defend her world, just a sharp tongue and a stubborn sense of justice. And when you hear the sagas speak of good wives, it isn't just about weaving or child-rearing. It's about making the 1,000 tiny decisions that kept a farm alive through ice storms, crop failures, and hungry neighbors. Here's a light joke for you. These women probably invented multitasking centuries before it became a modern workplace buzzword. One eye on the bread dough, one ear on the gossip about a neighbor's new ox, one foot ready to kick a goat away from the grain bin. Vikings didn't have sticky notes, but they had their wives, and that might have been better. Stepping out again, you see the fields stretching to the horizon, littered with stumps where trees once stood. Those fields were claimed, cleared, and cared for by men and women working together. But in those crucial moments when men vanished onto the sea, it was the women who kept the earth alive. That earth, after all, paid the taxes, fed the children, bought the trade goods, and kept the next shipbuilding project afloat. You catch sight of a woman kneeling by a stream, washing wool, eyes scanning the water for a hint of fish. Her bracelets jangle in rhythm with the current, reminding you that even simple chores carried power. She might gossip with another woman, trading information about who was traveling, who was dying, who was cheating. Information in a tight-knit Viking settlement was as valuable as coin. By night, those same women might gather in the longhouse, spinning wool together, exchanging stories that cemented alliances and passed down knowledge. No phones, no newsletters, just a web of women whispering secrets, warnings, and hopes, all while their fingers danced across the loom. If you think about it, they were basically the social network of the Viking Age. So the next time you hear a legend of Viking bravery, remember the courage of a woman who juggled food stores, herd counts, and a half-frozen river, all while keeping her children safe. She deserves a saga of her own, with no dragons or sea serpents required, just the quiet, powerful endurance of a queen of the keys. The torchlight flickers again, and you walk deeper into the hush of the Viking night. You're still thinking about those women with their keys, but now you want to know how they actually lived, their daily comforts and hidden hardships. You duck into a sleeping area, a low loft above the animals, where the smell of straw, sweat, and burning pitch clings to everything. Viking women slept side by side with their children, sometimes with a servant or foster child, and yes, even a prized lamb or two if the cold was sharp enough to bite through the walls. It wasn't all cozy winter snuggling, though. If you've ever tried to get decent rest with a snoring husband, two squirmy kids, and a goat head-butting the straw bin, well, you'd know these women were champions of patience. Historians still argue whether women actually had separate private quarters or simply carved out a bit of personal space with woven screens and blankets. Either way, privacy was a precious thing. Your nose wrinkles at the harsh soap made of ashes and animal fat, something these women would have used to scrub down wooden dishes or even themselves. It worked, sure, but it didn't exactly leave a lavender breeze in its wake. A quirky detail? Some Viking women took pride in how clean they kept their hair, even perfuming it with imported oils. Viking men adored their long, shining locks. But let's be honest, women were the real hair care queens, braiding and washing with a skill that would put a modern influencer to shame. By daylight, the routine started before sunrise. You see a woman stirring embers in the hearth to warm the porridge pot, then slipping outside to milk the cow, then returning to comb straw from the children's hair. It was a cycle of labor so constant that you can almost hear her bones creak. The kids, meanwhile, were sent out to fetch water or gather kindling, their little feet numb on icy dirt floors. When you look around the longhouse, you realize it was designed with women in mind as much as warriors. Storage benches doubled as beds, the walls were hung with wool to break the wind, and the best spot by the fire belonged to the one cooking, usually the matriarch. She controlled the rhythm of the day. Forget the modern phrase, "he who holds the remote rules the house." Here it was the woman with the soup ladle. They might have had a rough existence, but that didn't mean they lacked beauty or art. You can almost touch the intricate brooches pinned on their dresses, shaped like animals or knots, made from bronze, silver, even gold. Some were so finely worked they'd catch the light from the hearth and turn an ordinary tunic into a walking canvas. Jewelry was not only a mark of status, but also a secret signal of a woman's social network: who she married, who her family was, what alliances she could call on if things got dicey. Here's a funny thought for you. Women probably spent more time comparing brooch patterns than men spent sharpening their swords. A little friendly brooch envy, like the Viking equivalent of a handbag flex. And in these circles, you can bet that a misplaced brooch might spark as many rumors as a missing sheep. Food was another layer of power. Women decided what went into the pot, and that meant they controlled the subtle pecking order of meal times. Did a guest get the choicest meat, or just a lump of boiled barley? That was her decision. Hospitality was a serious business. One day a traitor, the next a potential warlord. A woman's skill at gracious hosting could make or break alliances. Imagine standing at the hearth, ladling stew for a stranger who might someday return with an entire warband. That's pressure. And yet, Viking women rose to it. They turned hospitality into an art, weaving courtesy and caution together with each portion served. Historians still argue whether these meals were opportunities for real negotiation or just showy rituals, but either way, you'd better believe women controlled the menu. At the edge of the village, you hear the sheep bleating, waiting to be milked. A woman steps forward, dress hiked above her ankles, her hands practiced and sure. You can see that same focus in a mother cradling her baby, singing a lullaby about far-off gods. These women were caretakers and protectors, weaving family strength into each child they raised. You wonder if they ever had time to think of anything beyond the next meal, the next winter, the next birth, but they must have. You sense it in the pride of a well-made brooch, the softness of a lullaby, the hush that falls when someone speaks of a daughter's marriage prospects. That hush is thick with dreams, fears, and ambitions. So many layers to a Viking woman's life: cook, caretaker, negotiator, artist, and mother. She balanced them all while staying upright through a world that expected her to be both soft and steel tough. If you think your job is stressful, just picture managing a household of 12 with no running water, no insulation, and no instant noodles. Some days, she probably longed for silence. A moment alone in a corner with only the crackle of the hearth for company. You almost see her now, pausing in the half-light, hands in her lap, just breathing. In that brief, stolen calm, you know a Viking woman claimed her own kind of freedom, no matter how small. You feel the smoke sting your eyes as you move back toward the doorway, leaving behind the warm chaos of the longhouse. The air outside is sharp, cold enough to cut through wool, but you keep going, curious about what lay beyond the hearth and home. Viking women might have run households with steely confidence, but that didn't mean they were confined to them. Oh no, some of these women had boots as worn as any wandering traders, and stories to match. Travel, you realize, was never exclusively a man's domain. There are tales of women who followed their husbands on long voyages, who sailed on dragon-prowed ships to settle new lands in Iceland, Greenland, even North America. Historians still argue whether women on these expeditions came of their own free will or were pressured, but once they stepped off the ship, there was no turning back. Imagine you're one of those women, gripping the rail as cold sea spray lashes your face, praying the waves don't swallow the boat whole. The wind roars like a beast, the deck rolls under your feet, and the distant promise of land seems as thin as smoke. But there you are, holding a baby wrapped in sheepskin, bracing against the sea. A little homesickness is nothing compared to that. Once ashore, these women became pioneers. They planted the first barley, built the first turf houses, laid out grazing plots for sheep, and measured the summer's brightness like clockmakers, trying to guess if winter would kill them before spring. It was a gamble with breathtaking stakes, and they had to be brave enough to place the bet. Not all Viking women crossed oceans. Many traveled overland as traders, moving through tangled forest tracks, crossing half-frozen rivers, bartering cloth, beads, or furs. You can see her, a woman with a battered pack across her shoulders, stopping at a smoky camp to trade news before trudging on toward the next market town. Her life was a rhythm of deals and danger, where a knife in the night was as real a risk as a missed bargain. A quirky tidbit? There's evidence women sometimes carried tiny trade weights sewn into their clothes, a sort of purse scale. If you imagine a modern woman weighing gold chains on a hidden micro scale, you'd be surprisingly close. It's the same hustle, just with more bears lurking in the forest. Their presence on trade routes created alliances far from their homelands, where a well-placed marriage could secure rights to a river crossing or a timber stand. Some Viking women were marriage brokers as much as wives, their journeys shaping not only their own fortunes but entire family futures. And while you're at it, picture the courage it took to walk into a hall of strangers, set down your goods, and start haggling in a language you barely spoke. Viking culture adored strong negotiation skills, and a woman who could talk circles around a stingy farmer was worth her weight in silver. Beyond that, Viking women also took religious traditions on the road. They carried family cults, household gods, protective amulets, all wrapped up in little cloth bags tucked under their dresses. In a new land, they'd rebuild the old faith bit by bit, anchoring it to fresh soil. Historians still argue whether this made them priestesses in practice or just careful guardians of memory, but their rituals mattered. You pause in the imagined evening, hearing the faintest echo of a woman singing over a cradle, her voice blending Norse with a sprinkle of Irish or Slavic words picked up along the way. Cultures tangled like that. The women braided them together, turning pieces of every place they touched into something that felt like home. They were the cultural glue. Whether settling on Greenland's edge or deep in a Baltic trading hub, these women stitched communities together. They kept people sane in the face of cold and hunger, offering a pot of warm stew or a clean bed for a night. They gave stories to children who didn't remember the homeland, and those stories would shape their courage for the next winter. Sometimes you suspect the men got the glory of conquest, the loot, the sagas, the boasts. But the women built the foundation that let those men even leave home in the first place. A Viking settlement without its women would have collapsed within a season. You smell smoke again. Campfires on a foreign shore, faint spices from trade goods, wool cloaks drying after a rain. You can see the silhouettes of women lifting pots, soothing babies, giving orders about where to drive the cattle next. They were as much a conquering force as any sword-armed warrior. And if you look closer, you'll notice something quietly radical in their journeys. These women were rewriting the idea of what it meant to be Viking. They carried not just their bodies, but their beliefs, their skills, and their fierce determination to endure. Each settlement, each tiny farm carved from the wild was a testament to them. When a woman stepped off a boat or out of a wagon and claimed new land, she made a promise to generations she'd never see that they too would have a place to stand. That's a legacy as powerful as any blade, and maybe more lasting. Your boots crunch against frost-hardened grass as you follow an imagined trail toward a Viking grave field. You notice how quiet it feels here, the hush of a resting place where even the wind seems to tread lightly. Among these graves you begin to see a pattern, women buried with brooches, keys, beads, and sometimes even weapons. That's a clue to their hidden power, a power that lived on after their last breath. Viking women did not go gentle into obscurity, even in death. You find graves of high-status women with keys carefully placed on their chests, a symbol of their authority over the household. Those keys opened storerooms, chests of valuables, perhaps even ritual objects no one else could touch. It was the Viking equivalent of holding the password to the entire community's bank account. Some of these graves get downright jaw-dropping. A few women were buried with ship remains, swords, shields, usually the stuff of male warriors. Historians still argue whether these were female warriors themselves or simply high-status women buried with masculine symbols. But you can't deny the symbolism. These women had earned enough respect to rest like chieftains. You pause by a grave marker, tracing its weathered outline in your mind. A runestone nearby shows a woman raising a horn, commemorated for generosity, courage, or simply a kind of iron-willed independence. And here comes a fringe tidbit. In rare cases, there are hints that Viking women were remembered for leading raids. A woman called the Lady of the Keys might have ruled a settlement while her husband was away, commanding warriors in his absence. Picture the absolute astonishment of an enemy force seeing a woman leading a shield wall. There's something deeply human in imagining their faces, the disbelief, the grudging respect, and probably a sense of deep terror. Burials also hint at the magical roles women played. Many graves include staffs of iron or wood, believed to be ritual tools of a seeress or vulva. These women acted as spiritual advisors, prophets, and healers, walking a thin line between the everyday world and the realm of spirits. Some even wore cloaks woven with feathers, so they might fly through their visions. If that doesn't feel powerfully metal, I don't know what does. They were feared, admired, and probably a little resented. The vulva carried stories through generations, performing rituals to protect the clan, ease childbirth, or predict a warrior's death. And in a society that respected fate above all, you can see why people hung on her every word. As you stand among the burial mounds, the hush becomes even heavier, like the past itself leaning close to your ear. These women were remembered not just for their work or motherhood, but for their leadership, their faith, their courage in the face of a merciless world. Even in death, they held the community together. And that leaves you wondering, what stories never got carved into the runes? How many women's names vanished because no one could pay for a stone or a poem? Historians still argue whether the majority of Viking women were honored this way or if these rich graves only represented a tiny elite. It's a humbling thought, how easily time can bury a name. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear them. The quiet pride of a woman who secured a food store so no one starved, who stood between her children and the night's howling dangers, who held the keys not just to a chest of silver, but to the very future. There's something haunting about the scent of crushed heather drifting on a cold breeze, something that feels like a whispered promise from the women who came before you. Their stories may be half lost, but their impact is built into every stone, every place name, every stubborn survivor who managed to get through another winter. You imagine the sound of a funerary song, voices rising together in an eerie, hypnotic chant. carrying the memory of the dead out into the dark. Even now, your spine tingles with how powerful that must have felt. Goosebumps, as the kids say. Though a Viking wouldn't have had a word for it, they definitely would have felt the same chill. When the last notes fade, silence rushes back in. You step away from the grave, reminded of a simple but unshakable truth. These Viking women were never merely background characters in someone else's saga. They built the saga. They wrote its rules. They even enforced its endings. So, next time someone jokes that Vikings were all muscle and no heart, you can remember these key keepers and shield bearers, these seers and stewards, who guarded the future with the same iron determination they carried through every brutal storm. That alone is worth 1,000 sword-swinging boasts. And as you leave the grave field behind, you feel a kind of peace, like you've been reminded of a secret, one that might make even the rowdiest warrior pause for a moment. That sometimes the strongest part of the Viking legacy rested not on a blade, but in the steady, unwavering hands of its women. The dawn cracks through the narrow shutters of a turf-roofed hall, and you step inside to see the household already in motion. Viking women, contrary to the myths of passive shield maidens or distant wives, ran the world inside these walls. You see them managing everything from dairy cows to legal disputes, in a kind of never-ending domestic battle that would humble any raiding chieftain. Their days began before the sun rose. You picture them stooping over the hearth, stirring embers back to life, baking bread dense enough to break a tooth if you got cocky, and brewing ale that doubled as water treatment. That's right, a historical fact you might not expect. Viking ale was safer than water because boiling the grain killed off pathogens. Historians still argue whether the taste was tolerable or if you just learned to ignore it. And after the bread was set, the real work began. These women tracked the farm's accounts, managed trade deals, oversaw cloth production, and directed thralls in a rhythm so efficient it might leave a modern project manager weeping. Picture the spreadsheet from Valhalla, only instead of Excel formulas, you've got tally sticks and a brain sharper than a sea-axe blade. But don't get the idea it was all about bean counting and yarn spinning. Sometimes women had to act as judges inside the hall, resolving conflicts when the men were away on raids. They knew how to negotiate bride prices, settle land disputes, and if pressed, call on extended kin for backup. They were no gentle little lambs. One fringe tidbit for you. Viking women had a right to divorce their husbands, a shocker compared to many medieval societies. If your man failed in bed or embarrassed you in public, you could pack up his stuff and send him home to his mama. That's about as close to an ancient prenup as you'd get. There's something satisfying, even today, about imagining a woman standing up in the middle of a feast, declaring her husband too cowardly to keep, and dropping the social hammer before a stunned crowd. You'd probably go viral for that kind of courage. As you move deeper into the hall, you catch the smell of wool being dyed, the metallic tang of iron tools, the earthy perfume of drying herbs. Every sense feels busy, just like these women's lives. The children might run circles around the benches, the goats bleating, a dog chasing off a fox, while the mistress of the house calmly organizes everything, as if commanding a war band. There was an entire cultural pride in running a good household. The sagas praised women who kept their kin strong through hard times, who made sure there was food even after a failed harvest, who found a way to keep peace among feuding cousins. You suspect half the so-called great Viking men owed their glory to a mother who refused to let them grow up as slackers. You can practically see the women's minds working like a loom, weaving community ties, balancing debts, preparing for feasts, soothing hurt feelings, and sometimes, as you'd expect, laying down the law with a voice that brooked no argument. These queens of the hearth were as powerful in their way as any jarls on the battlefield. It's worth remembering, too, that many Viking settlements survived only because women adapted to new lands. When their families traveled to Iceland, Greenland, even Vinland, these women had to recreate an entire domestic economy from scratch. The first cow milked in a freezing Icelandic winter might have spelled the difference between life and death. That small, practical courage deserves its own saga. And it's a story we should say out loud more often because you can feel it echo through time. A woman, wrapped in a cloak against the chill, planning how to feed her children in a place no one had ever survived before. That is bravery, whether or not she ever held a sword. Historians still argue whether Viking women held formal political power, or if their influence stayed mostly informal. But no one can deny that they carried their world on their shoulders, and usually without a single complaint. Maybe that's the reason later chroniclers tried to write them out of the picture, because it's hard to admit that the strongest link in the Viking chain wasn't a sword, but a mother's open palm, steady and unshaking. As you leave the busy hall behind, stepping into the pale winter light, you realize you've come to respect these women more than any axe-wielding berserker. They were tough, funny, resourceful, and almost supernaturally patient, holding together families, land, and culture through years that would have broken most modern souls. So the next time someone tries to reduce the Viking Age to horned helmets and blood-soaked raids, you can smile and think of these women with their keys, their ledgers, their iron will, and their unstoppable talent for keeping everyone alive. That, you suspect, is the true heroic saga, and no poem carved in runes could ever quite capture how enormous their legacy really was. You leave the warm smell of bread and wool behind, stepping out onto a frost-rimmed path where the horizon glows pink over far hills. Your feet crunch through an icy crust, and you think of how many women followed this same trail to tend flocks, fetch water, or gather herbs. Their footsteps formed a kind of unspoken map, a path of duty that no saga bard ever bothered to sing. Viking women's labor extended far beyond the four walls of their turf homes. They managed the seasonal migrations of sheep and cattle, oversaw the slaughtering and curing of meat, and had an almost supernatural sense for the weather, reading wind and clouds as surely as a sailor reads the sea. Historians still argue whether women learned these skills directly from their mothers or from trial and error. Either way, they had to get it right, or their entire community could starve. One mainstream fact that deserves repeating is that many Viking farms were left entirely in female hands for months or years while husbands, fathers, and sons sailed off to plunder or trade. Women became de facto mayors, supply chain managers, head chefs, medics, and judges. You might call them the world's first multitaskers, though the term feels laughably modern for what they accomplished. A fringe tidbit to brighten your night. Some women practiced a type of folk magic called cedar, believed to be tied to spinning and weaving, but also to seeing the future. It's a bit like being a Norse oracle, but with a distaff instead of a crystal ball. You can almost picture a woman quietly spinning flax on a spindle while muttering prophecies about a neighbor's marriage or a coming famine, or whether that cousin Bjorn would ever learn to aim properly with a spear. In some Icelandic sagas, these seeresses traveled from farm to farm, welcomed with food and gifts in exchange for glimpses of destiny. You get the sense that even the bravest chieftain might quake in his boots if a seeress dropped by with a grim vision of what tomorrow could bring. And yet for most Viking women, daily survival was magic enough. Imagine trying to keep a household running through a winter where the sun barely rose, or through a storm that scattered the fishing boats. With no modern insulation or central heating, the hall's hearth was literally the heartbeat of the home, and if a woman failed to keep the coals alive, the entire family could freeze. In the backfields, you hear goats bleating, chickens scratching under low brush, and you sense a hidden rhythm that all Viking women knew by heart. They measured the year not by a wall calendar, but by the growth of the lambs, the fattening of pigs, the ripeness of cloudberries, the drift of snow across a fence. This deep environmental knowledge, you might even call it an ancient eco-awareness, made them indispensable. If a woman misjudged the timing of a barley harvest, the result was hunger. If she let an illness spread among the sheep, the family might lose its only source of trade goods. It was, in truth, an invisible battlefield where the stakes were just as high as any raid across the sea. That power, the power of knowing how to keep people alive, gave Viking women a confidence and independence that shocked later medieval chroniclers. You'd love to see one of those dusty old scribes walk up to a Viking farm wife and try to tell her what to do. He'd probably find himself sleeping in the goat shed, lucky to keep his skin intact. There's a quiet awe in thinking of these women, steady and strong, hauling buckets of water from a frozen well, grinding grain until their shoulders burned, dressing wounds after a hunting mishap, and never expecting a round of applause for it. They did what had to be done, day after day, year after year, building entire communities with nothing more than patient courage. You might remember how they carried keys at their belts. Keys to pantries, storehouses, guest chests, symbols of absolute trust. Viking men might hold the swords, but women held the keys, and those keys could open or close someone's fate just as decisively as a blade. Historians still argue whether this power was truly respected or merely tolerated, but no one denies its existence. These keys were more than lumps of iron. They were a sign that the woman who wore them was the foundation of her world. As you trudge on down the track, night drawing closer, you realize these keys are like a perfect metaphor for Viking women. They open the doors of survival, of family, of prosperity, and even, in their quiet ways, of freedom. So next time you hear a tale of a bold Viking ship, remember the women who stayed home and kept that world turning while the sea took its toll. The path twists again, and you glimpse a sheep pen ahead, filled with steaming, woolly bodies pressed against each other for warmth. Someone will be there at dawn to milk them, to check for birthing, to fend off wolves. That someone was, more often than not, a woman, keeping watch while the rest of the settlement dreamed of gold or fame. You smile, thinking of how many Viking men returned from the ocean only to discover their wives had not only managed the farm but improved it, negotiated better alliances, and perhaps even built a new guest hall. Now that is a true conquest. No axe or shield needed. You leave the sheep pen behind, climbing a small rise that looks out over the valley, where torchlights from distant farms glitter like tiny, trembling stars. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the hush of a hearth fire being banked for the night, or the low voices of families sharing news and jokes before sleep. Here, in these quiet hours, Viking women found another kind of work, storytelling, teaching, passing down everything they knew to the next generation. Historians still argue whether these fireside tales were mainly about family pride or about cautionary lessons, but one thing is sure, women's voices kept memory alive. You picture a grandmother with hair like braided silver, recalling how she and her sisters once carried buckets through a snowstorm, or how an entire village survived a famine thanks to one clever barter. These stories became a kind of legacy, and you sense that even a warlord fresh off the ship would pause to listen. A mainstream fact to hang on to is that literacy was far from universal, even among Viking chieftains. So a woman's memory was her library, storing lineages, property claims, marriage terms, and the tangled alliances of the extended kin group. Forget a single name or debt, and you might lose land or spark a feud. Forget a bride price or a funeral debt, and someone could start sharpening their spear. Viking women carried these mental ledgers with the same focus you might bring to juggling a dozen passwords, only with higher stakes. A fringe tidbit just for you, there's evidence that some women, especially wealthy ones, could commission elaborate memory aids carved onto rune sticks, tiny portable notepads you might say, so they didn't lose track of all those obligations. Imagine clipping a rune stick to your belt alongside your keys. checking it before a guest meal to be sure you remembered whose cousin had given you that slab of smoked trout last harvest. As you wander downhill again, a soft wind brings the scent of crushed heather, reminding you how deeply these women belong to their landscapes. They were as rooted as the barley they sowed, their lives tangled in the rivers and meadows of the north. And yet, for all that rootedness, Viking women also carried a fierce independence. Their husbands could vanish over the horizon for years, even die on distant shores, and still they found ways to adapt, to remarry, to keep the land productive. That was another hidden truth. Viking widows had remarkable freedom compared to many medieval Christian societies. They could inherit farms, choose new partners, even sue in court to defend their rights. You can almost see a sharp-eyed widow, cloak pinned against the wind, arguing her case before a thing assembly, refusing to let any neighbor steal her cows. Historians still debate whether these rights were widespread or reserved for wealthier classes. But there's no question they existed. Viking women weren't helpless while their men roamed the seas. They stepped forward, claimed their place, and proved that a household could stand strong even without a sword at its head. You hear the distant creak of a barn door, someone securing the animals for the night, and it strikes you that all these little rituals, shutting the animals in, covering the fire, saying a quick prayer to Thor or Freya, were woven together by women's hands. They built security out of repetition, creating a kind of peace in a world that otherwise seemed to lurch from chaos to chaos. Those same hands braided children's hair, treated wounds, embroidered fine tunics for guests, measured out the precious winter ale, and pressed love tokens into their men's hands before a voyage. You could argue those tokens carried more power than any blade, a reminder that someone waited at home, that there was a hearth and a heart to return to. Out beyond the valley, the sea waits with its hungry roar. You think of the Viking ships slicing across foam, every man on board dreaming of glory and loot. But back here in the homesteads, a different kind of courage played out. It was a courage built on constancy, on the quiet strength of feeding children, maintaining bonds, refusing to let despair take root in the hard winters. A joke to keep things gentle. If Viking women had a motto, it might have been, "Sure, go raid Paris, but don't you dare come home and complain if the goats aren't milked." You suspect more than one shield brother got an earful about muddy boots after all that heroic adventure. In the hush of these farm valleys, you sense the heartbeat of an entire civilization, a heartbeat that didn't come from the clash of steel, but from steady, loving, determined hands. Viking women were, in many ways, the true weavers of fate, holding the threads of land, family, and memory together while the world spun around them. So as you walk the last steps toward a low hall where a faint lamp burns in the window, you might whisper a thanks. Thanks to the women who stayed, who endured, who planned for bad harvests and rebuilt after storms. Thanks to the ones whose names never made it into the heroic epics, but whose courage was carved into every nail, every fence, every surviving soul. And maybe, just maybe, you realize they're still with you. In every story you hear, every rune you glimpse, every night you listen for tales by the fire. Your boots crunch over a line of crushed oyster shells leading up to a doorway, a reminder of feasts long past when neighbors gathered to share pickled fish and sweet mead, laughing into the night. Viking women stood at the center of those gatherings, their presence tying together alliances and rivalries, smoothing over arguments with careful words and sly jokes. You can almost picture a woman raising an eyebrow, catching a guest before he started a drunken brawl, reminding him with a gentle voice that tomorrow's sunrise still needed to be faced. It's easy to forget that these women were skilled diplomats in their own way, trained from girlhood to manage household quarrels, trade disputes, even mild clan feuds. A clever wife might save a man's life just by knowing exactly what to offer a rival. A copper brooch, a good horse, a promise of hospitality next winter. Historians still argue whether Viking women took these roles formally or simply acted by tradition, but no one doubts they learned these arts young and practiced them every day. You pass under a low lintel beam and step into a hall that smells of pine smoke, tar, and warm bread. The hush of the place wraps around you like a blanket. You notice the loom against the far wall, half-finished linen still draped from its frame. That loom is more than a tool. It is an anchor. The weaving of cloth symbolized order, stability, and quiet power. It is said some women wove spells into those cloths, a protection for men who would travel far, a wish for luck that no sword could match. A mainstream historical fact slips through your mind. Viking burial finds often include weaving tools, even among the most prestigious graves, which shows how vital and respected this work was. Women could command entire textile operations, trading finished goods across Europe and beyond. Picture some fierce grandmother driving a hard bargain with a Frankish merchant while keeping a toddler perched on her hip, multitasking before it had a name. You might chuckle at a fringe tidbit too. A handful of runic inscriptions hint that women used coded messages hidden in cloth patterns to pass secrets, though scholars still debate if that was true or wishful thinking. Either way, you have to admire the flair. In this hall tonight, the hush is soon broken by the voices of children asking for a story. The woman by the loom turns, her eyes lit by the embers, and begins to speak. You lean in, catching every word, as if you too were a child by that hearth. She talks of faraway raids, of great kings who fell in battle, of gods who tested mortals. But woven through these grand sagas are the names of women, wives who rescued prisoners, sisters who plotted revenge, daughters who chose their own lovers against all odds. It hits you that these women were not only keeping households together, but also rewriting the rules of their own destiny. They found room to resist, to challenge, to shape their own fates, even when the law or the sword seemed against them. Some historians still argue whether their influence was exaggerated in later legends, but the consistent threads of courage and cleverness are impossible to ignore. Outside, a cold breeze rattles the wooden shutters, reminding you that winter comes fast in the north. But Viking women had long prepared for that, preserving fish, drying herbs, salting meat, storing nuts, patching cloaks, checking the firewood, and calculating exactly how long the candles would last. Their minds were calendars, their hands insurance policies. You would never starve if a good woman ran the hall, no matter how many storms battered the fjord. You smile at a silly thought. If Viking women had invented online dating, they'd have required profiles to list how many cows you could keep alive over winter and how much wool you could card before sunset. Romance, Viking style, was woven with practicality, or maybe practicality was woven with romance. Hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Back by the loom, the story winds down. The children drift to sleep, the embers glow like foxfire, and you realize these Viking women were never only background figures. They were the daily warriors, the quiet strategists, the healers, the traders, the judges, the survivors, and the teachers. They deserve every bit of respect given to the warriors whose names still echo down sword halls. Your own footsteps grow slower, the shadows growing longer as you step back outside. The air is sharp, a final reminder of how these women carried on through all the world's changes, surviving, adapting, holding together farms, families, and futures. They were not simply Viking wives or mothers, but Viking powerhouses, commanding resources and wielding a soft but unstoppable strength. So tonight, if you find yourself drifting towards sleep, think of them. Picture the rhythmic shuttle of the loom, the even voice soothing a crying child, the confidence of a woman who knew her worth and would defend it with every scrap of courage in her body. Remember how they claimed the right to manage wealth, to shape alliances, to steer entire dynasties. And most of all, remember how they kept going no matter what storms rolled in from the endless sea. Now, as the night settles over your own roof, allow your breath to grow slower, your thoughts to quiet, and your heart to rest. You've traveled far tonight, but these women will stay with you, woven into memory, strong and shining, like threads of gold in a tapestry that will never tear. Your eyes grow heavier as you stand in that silent doorway, the chill of the Viking night slipping into your bones, reminding you how far you've come tonight through the sagas of these extraordinary women. Their lives might feel impossibly distant, their looms, their trade routes, their hard-earned authority, but something about them still echoes right here, right now. You can sense their courage stitched between the lines, an unbreakable thread holding a world together. Let the hush of the hall wrap around you like a soft wool cloak. Let the fire's last glow soothe your restless mind. Imagine those steady hands preparing bread for tomorrow's dawn, arranging herbs against illness, comforting a child from nightmares. Their resilience becomes yours. A quiet reminder that even in the harshest winters, warmth can be found, and hope, and a deep, calming sense of belonging. If your thoughts wander to the sea, to distant husbands or sons who never returned, trust that these women carried on, held strong, mended what was broken, and told stories until the world felt safe again. You are allowed to rest now, knowing that someone has always kept the hearth warm against the dark. Breathe a little slower. Feel the calm settle in your shoulders and let sleep come softly. Your journey through their memories is complete for tonight, but their bravery will stay woven around you, guarding you like the woven spells they tucked into every cloth and cloak. Close your eyes, drift through the quiet rhythms, and let that quiet confidence of Viking women guide you to peaceful dreams. Because even in a world of storms, the gentle strength they left behind can still carry you home.